Welcome to Journey Through Time, a place where we move slowly through the planet's deep past and let the story unfold without hurry. Today we're traveling far beyond human history into an Earth that no longer looks familiar, to a time when almost all land was joined as one. The supercontinent Pangea. Pangea was a colossal landmass that once united nearly all the continents. It's a name found in textbooks and documentaries, yet few imagine what it truly felt like. Picture standing on that ancient ground. Endless plains, red deserts, strange forests, giant insects and reptiles, and no ocean breaking the horizon. To understand this world, you must set aside the map you know. There was no Atlantic, no Pacific, just one vast land surrounded by one immense ocean. You could have walked from what is now North America into Africa or Europe without ever seeing a sea. But this was not a quiet Earth. Forces deep below were pushing and folding the crust, raising mountains, opening rifts, and feeding volcanoes that painted the sky with fire. The climate was harsh, hot, dry summers in the interior, biting winters, and little rain far from the coasts. Yet life adapted. Ancient forests, enormous insects, and early reptiles all flourished under strange conditions. Most striking of all was the absence of boundaries. Rivers crossed what would later become separate continents. Forests stretched for thousands of kilometers without interruption. Animals roamed freely from one end of the land to the other. Winds, storms, and climates were shaped by this unity, influencing evolution on a continental scale. Before we can explore how Pangea eventually broke apart, we must understand how it came together. Over hundreds of millions of years, drifting continents collided, welding mountains into the sky and leaving scars still visible today. Imagine standing in the interior of Pangea, thousands of kilometers from the nearest ocean. The air would feel different, the climate more extreme, the sense of isolation profound. But in this crucible, life evolved new strategies. Giant insects, pioneering reptiles, and resilient forests shaped a unified world unlike anything we know. Long before the modern continents drifted apart, Earth went through repeated cycles of assembly and separation. Pangea was only the latest in a long line of supercontinents. Rodinia, Nuna, and others had risen and vanished before it. Over hundreds of millions of years, smaller land masses collided, building mountains and leaving deep scars in the crust. These seams still lie hidden under our feet, proof of the planet's restless history. By about 300 million years ago, the fragments of future continents were moving together again. Laurentia, Proto-North America; Gondwana, the future South America; Africa, Antarctica, Australia, and India, and smaller pieces like Baltica and Siberia, were on a slow collision course. As oceans shrank, island chains were swallowed and shallow seas disappeared. With every impact, the world moved closer to a single landmass. These collisions did not just reshape geography. They altered climate and life itself. Mountain ranges rose and redirected winds, trapping moisture on one side and casting deserts on the other. Glaciers carved into Gondwana's surface while tropical swamps flourished elsewhere, laying down the coal beds we mine today. High oxygen levels allowed insects to grow to giant size, while reptiles adapted to new habitats, emerging between forests, swamps, and deserts. Imagine Earth then from above. A vast ocean called Panthalassa, surrounding great creeping continents, their edges grinding together, their mountains buckling skyward. Volcanoes erupted along these seams, filling the air with ash and greenhouse gases. As the land converged, the atmosphere shifted, currents changed, and life was forced to adapt, again and again. This slow-motion choreography prepared the stage for Pangea's final formation. By the end of this process, almost all land lay fused into one. Mountains towered along the collision zones, deserts began to form in the interior, and the climate patterns that would dominate for millions of years were already taking shape. The world was gathering itself into one continent, and about to enter one of the most extraordinary chapters in Earth's history. With the continents locked together, Pangea transformed the entire Earth system. The immense size of the supercontinent created a new kind of land far from the sea, an interior so vast that moisture from the coasts rarely arrived. Enormous deserts formed, some stretching thousands of kilometers. In contrast, near the coasts, heavy rains nourished dense forests and swamps. Red beds and coal seams preserved in today's rocks mark these extremes, proof of the supercontinent's climate zones. Pangea straddled the equator, combining tropical belts with frozen poles in one landmass. From glacial ice sheets in the south to humid rainforests near the equator, the planet hosted climates more varied and interconnected than anything we see today. Winds traveled farther and more directly without oceans to block them. Dust from the deserts reached the coasts and the ocean beyond, feeding nutrient cycles across the world. Seasonal monsoons drenched some areas while leaving others in crushing drought. This configuration also erased barriers for plants and animals. Species evolved and spread across thousands of kilometers without being stopped by seas. Fossils of identical creatures found in places as distant as South America and Africa show how unified the world once was. The same wind systems, the same rivers, the same open corridors allowed life to disperse on a continental scale. Evolution was no longer confined to isolated regions. It unfolded across an entire planet, joined as one. The coastal regions of Pangea were alive with activity. Warm, shallow seas flooded low-lying land, creating wetlands, tidal flats, and vast deltas. Forests of seed ferns, towering conifers, and early cycads lined the rivers, while insects buzzed through humid air. Amphibians thrived in these water-rich environments, laying their eggs in rivers and swamps, while reptiles began to push inland, freed from their dependence on aquatic breeding. The ocean itself, Panthalassa, was immense, covering nearly 3/4 of the planet. With only one massive continent to disrupt it, its currents circled the Earth like a vast conveyor, redistributing heat from equator to poles. In the shallows, early reefs and coral-like structures flourished, supporting diverse marine life from primitive fish to invertebrates. Nutrient-rich sediments from the land fed these ecosystems, linking rivers to reefs in a single planetary loop. Yet only a few hundred kilometers inland, the greenery faded. Rainfall diminished, temperatures swung between extremes, and deserts began. This sharp contrast between fertile coasts and arid interiors defined Pangea's ecology. Dust storms from the interior carried minerals to the ocean, while seasonal monsoons flooded coastal plains and reshaped the landscape year after year. Every zone was connected to every other, a single system of land, sea, and air in constant motion. In the great interior of Pangea, isolation and extremes shaped life in new ways. Rain was scarce, rivers were temporary, and the air swung from blistering heat by day to biting cold at night. Plants here were sparse and tough. Early conifers, seed ferns, and low shrubs with deep roots adapted to find hidden moisture. Animals evolved strategies to cope. Small reptiles burrowed for shelter. Early mammal-like creatures became active at cooler hours, and only the hardiest forms survived the vast dry plains. Fossil evidence shows that even these deserts were not empty. Springs and seasonal floods created oases, where life briefly exploded before fading again. Dust from the interior fed distant forests, proving that even the harshest regions were part of the continent's greater cycle. Migration across such distances took generations, leading populations to specialize and evolve unique traits distinct from their coastal relatives. Wind was a constant companion in the heart of Pangea. Without mountains or forests to slow it, it swept across the land, carrying dust from one horizon to another. Over millions of years, this process sculpted dunes and carved patterns into stone, leaving a record of ancient weather still visible today. This was a world of muted reds and browns, a sky of intense blue by day and dazzling stars by night. And yet, it was alive, shaping the resilience of the creatures who endured it. Beneath Pangea's vast surface, the planet's engine never stopped. Heat rose from the mantle, pushing and pulling at the seams where continents had fused. Along these sutures, chains of volcanoes erupted, some steadily spilling lava for centuries, others exploding in sudden cataclysms that sent ash and gases high into the atmosphere. Ancient lava flows, now preserved in stone, trace the outlines of these once active zones, and beds of volcanic ash record the pulses of a restless Earth. Volcanoes reshaped the landscape on a continental scale. Layer upon layer of hardened basalt built plateaus that later eroded into rugged highlands. Ash enriched soils, creating fertile patches amid otherwise harsh terrain. But each eruption also transformed the climate. Carbon dioxide released into the air warmed the planet over millennia, while sulfur aerosols from especially violent events cooled it temporarily by reflecting sunlight back into space. This rhythm of warming and cooling produced an unpredictable climate in which life had to constantly adjust. Fires swept across Pangea's resin-rich forests, ignited by lightning or by the heat and ashfall from nearby eruptions. These wildfires cleared old growth, fertilized the ground with nutrients, and opened space for new plant life to emerge. For animals, the changes were both threat and opportunity. Ash clouds blocked sunlight and forced migrations, but newly enriched landscapes provided fresh habitats. Dust and minerals from these events also reached the surrounding ocean, feeding marine ecosystems and linking land to sea in cycles of destruction and renewal. Toward the end of the Permian, enormous eruptions in what is now Siberia poured lava over millions of square kilometers, triggering profound changes in atmosphere and ocean chemistry. This event, known as the Siberian Traps, marked the beginning of Earth's greatest mass extinction, but it also underscored how deeply geology and biology were intertwined. Even in quieter times, volcanoes gave Pangea its pulse, a heartbeat of molten rock and shifting ground, echoing beneath every forest, desert, and coastline. The air above Pangea carried its own story. Oxygen levels fluctuated dramatically across geologic time. In the late Carboniferous, oxygen may have reached 30% of the atmosphere compared to 21% today, fueling the rise of enormous insects and arthropods, whose bodies depended on diffusion to breathe. Dragonflies with wingspans longer than a human arm, millipede-like arthropods stretching meters in length, and dense swarms of other invertebrates filled the skies and undergrowth. As the supercontinent stabilized into the Permian, oxygen began to decline toward 15%. Modern humans would have struggled to breathe, but animals adapted with more efficient lungs and circulatory systems. Meanwhile, volcanic eruptions released carbon dioxide, intensifying greenhouse effects that warmed coastal forests but deepened the aridity of the interior. The atmosphere's chemistry thus became a direct driver of evolution, favoring some species while forcing others into decline. Plants responded too. High carbon dioxide levels encouraged vast forests of seed ferns, early conifers and cycads to flourish, drawing down CO2 and pumping out oxygen in return. These forests acted as oxygen factories, stabilizing soils and creating microclimates along rivers and deltas. Wind systems spanning thousands of kilometers carried dust from the deserts to these green belts, fertilizing them with minerals from the dry core. Even the color and quality of the sky shifted over time. Fine volcanic aerosols scattered sunlight, turning sunsets deep red and making the horizon hazy, while clear periods revealed an immense unbroken blue vault stretching across the land. Summers in the interior baked under hot, dry air. Winters cooled sharply under thin skies. Along the coasts, monsoon winds brought humid seasons and dry seasons, dictating the rhythm of life for plants, reptiles, and early mammal-like creatures. Every adaptation, from the shape of leaves to the structure of lungs, reflected this atmosphere, and every shift in the air rippled through Pangea's interconnected web of life, proving that even the winds and gases above were part of the same planetary system, binding deserts, forests, and oceans together. As life spread across Pangea, reptiles and early mammal-like creatures began to shape the land as much as the land shaped them. Amphibians still dominated rivers and swamps along the coasts, but reptiles had evolved the amniotic egg, freeing them from water-based reproduction. This single innovation opened the interior, allowing them to colonize deserts and dry plains, where amphibians could not survive. Among these pioneers were the synapsids, sometimes called mammal-like reptiles, a transitional group bridging cold-blooded past and warm-blooded future. Some synapsids were small, sharp-toothed insect hunters darting among seed ferns. Others were massive herbivores with barrel-shaped bodies built for digesting tough plants. Dimetrodon, with its sprawling body and tall sail, used that structure perhaps to regulate temperature or for display, an advantage in Pangea's extreme climate. More advanced therapsids began to appear, with stronger limbs, differentiated teeth, and possibly early hair-like structures. Sleek predators, such as the gorgonopsids, roamed the dry interior plains, their saber-like teeth and muscular builds making them the apex hunters of their time. Stocky, tusked herbivores, known as dicynodonts, may have traveled in herds, moving between wetter coasts and drier heartlands. Fossils of these creatures appear on continents now separated by oceans, proof of their continental range during the age of Pangea. This open geography also created an evolutionary arms race. As herbivores grew larger to survive long migrations and scarce water, predators evolved greater speed and power to follow them. With no oceans to block their path, species could spread rapidly, carrying new traits across climates from equatorial forests to polar deserts. Evolution no longer worked in isolated pockets, but across a vast unified landscape, accelerating diversification and adaptation. Insects remained the foundation of this world's food web. Giant dragonflies and sprawling millipedes fed reptiles and amphibians. Termite-like species may have begun forming colonies, even in arid zones, shaping soils and creating microhabitats. Every creature was part of a grand experiment in survival on a borderless Earth. By the late Permian, the blueprint of future ecosystems, including the traits that would one day lead to mammals and dinosaurs, was already in place, tested in the crucible of Pangea's extremes. To witness this time would be to see the first outlines of the modern biosphere forming on an alien stage. Reptiles adapting to deserts, mammal-like creatures experimenting with warm-blooded traits, forests spreading oxygen and stabilizing climate, and the winds of a single atmosphere linking every living thing under one sky. Pangea's forests were the living lungs of the supercontinent. Stretching along rivers, coasts, and mountain foothills, they anchored the soil, enriched the atmosphere, and provided shelter for countless creatures. In the humid belts near the equator, vast stands of seed ferns created green cathedrals where sunlight filtered through giant fronds. Their decaying matter built thick, dark soils and laid down the coal seams that would one day power human industry. Among these plants, early conifers rose like spires. Their needle-shaped leaves adapted to a wide range of climates, from tropical wetlands to upland plateaus. Closer to the interior, drought-tolerant species dominated. Hardy cycads and low shrubs held their ground where rainfall thinned. Their deep roots stabilized the landscape and provided food for synapsid herbivores roaming between the forests and the deserts. This transition zone, not fully green, not yet barren, acted as a corridor for animals moving across the continent. Here, reptiles adapted to both worlds, finding shade under scattered trees and crossing open ground between oases. Wetlands formed a different realm. Horsetails and club mosses grew as thick as bamboo, their hollow stems binding riverbanks against floods. Amphibians bred in these waters, while early reptiles hunted at the edges. Insects thrived in the humid air, from shimmering dragonflies to giant detritivores that recycled fallen leaves into the soil. These ecosystems acted as nurseries, incubating diversity before it spread outward to harsher regions. The forests themselves were dynamic. Wildfires periodically cleared old growth, volcanic ash fertilized new plantings, and seasonal floods shifted channels and soils. This constant reshaping ensured a mosaic of habitats, rather than a single unbroken expanse. In such a world, adaptation was not optional, but continuous. Each plant species competed for light, water, and space. Each animal evolved to exploit or survive the shifting conditions. To walk in these forests would be to experience a sensory overload. Humid air, heavy with resin and decay, shafts of sunlight slicing through towering fronds, insects buzzing in a ceaseless chorus, and underfoot the soft mat of millennia of fallen plant matter. Every leaf, every root, every breath tied directly into Pangea's planetary engine. The animals of Pangea reflected its immense variety of landscapes. In the coastal wetlands, amphibians still ruled, from small nimble species breathing through their skin to massive crocodile-like predators waiting motionless beneath the water. Yet reptiles and synapsids were steadily eclipsing them, spreading across dry lands and developing traits that would define the next era of life on Earth. Insects provided the foundation of the food web. Swarms of large winged species hovered above rivers, while giant millipede-like arthropods crept through the undergrowth. Beetles, primitive cockroaches, and early relatives of ants and termites formed bustling microcosms beneath the forest canopy, recycling nutrients and feeding the first small reptiles that ventured beyond the swamps. Reptiles diversified into diapsids and synapsids, the two great lineages that would eventually produce crocodiles, lizards, snakes, dinosaurs, and mammals. In the forests, small insectivorous reptiles darted among ferns and conifers. On the open plains, barrel-bodied herbivores browsed on tough cycads and seed ferns. Predatory forms evolved powerful jaws, long limbs, and acute senses to track prey across wide distances. Among the most advanced were the therapsids, which began to show mammal-like features, upright limb posture, differentiated teeth, and perhaps early whiskers or hair-like insulation. These adaptations increased speed, efficiency, and thermoregulation, giving them an edge in Pangea's shifting climates. Apex predators, such as gorgonopsids, stalked the arid interior, their saber-like teeth and muscular builds signaling a new level of predatory dominance. Meanwhile, dicynodonts, tusked, beaked herbivores, may have formed social groups or herds, migrating between coasts and heartlands. This interconnected geography meant evolutionary innovations spread quickly. A predator evolving in one corner of Pangea could follow its prey into entirely new climates, driving rapid adaptation across the supercontinent. Herbivores dispersed seeds as they migrated. Dust storms carried nutrients to distant forests. Monsoon rains linked upland rivers to coastal deltas. Evolution unfolded not in isolation, but on a continental stage, accelerating the pace and scale of change. Life in Pangea thus existed as a single immense experiment. Each ecosystem, forest, desert, wetland, mountain, fed into every other. By the late Permian, the blueprint of the modern biosphere was emerging. Complex food webs, large mobile herbivores, active predators, and the first stirrings of traits that would one day define mammals and dinosaurs. Standing there, you would see a living planet, forging its next great chapter under a single sky. Deep beneath Pangea, forces were preparing its eventual breakup, even as the supercontinent seemed at its height. The same tectonic power that had welded continents together also strained their seams, building heat and tension. Cracks began as subtle rifts, long valleys where the crust stretched and thinned. Over millions of years, magma welled up through these gaps, feeding new volcanoes and hinting at oceans yet to come. In what is now eastern North America and western Africa, geologists trace these ancient rift zones. Fault lines, basalt flows, and tilted rock layers reveal where the Earth's crust once pulled apart. Lakes and rivers formed in these depressions, transforming the local climate and creating fertile basins. Eventually, seawater would pour into these rifts to form the Atlantic Ocean, but in the age of Pangea, they were only the first signs of division. The splitting of Pangea changed more than the land. Atmospheric currents adjusted as coastlines shifted and new seas began to open. Moisture reached regions previously cut off, while others dried further. Plants and animals that had ranged freely across the continent now began to encounter barriers. Highlands, valleys, and expanding waterways that separated populations and triggered new evolutionary paths. Life responded with resilience. Early reptiles diversified into new lineages, some of which would give rise to dinosaurs in the Triassic. Synapsids evolved steadily toward mammalian traits, refining warm-blooded metabolism, more efficient lungs, and complex social behaviors. Forests advanced and retreated with shifting rainfall, and deserts waxed and waned as mountain ranges rose along the rift zones. This was the beginning of the end for a single borderless world. Yet even as cracks spread and climates shifted, the legacy of Pangea endured. Its unified past had allowed species to mix on a global scale. Its tectonic collisions had built mountains still standing today, and its deserts and forests had seeded future ecosystems. The supercontinent had defined an age and prepared the Earth for the next great transformation. To stand on Pangea during this time would have been to witness a paradox, a land both whole and already dividing, a climate both stable and restless, and life both thriving and reshaping itself in anticipation of change. The ground beneath your feet would tremble with the deep, slow power of tectonics, while the horizon remained vast and open, hinting at oceans yet unborn. This was the hinge between two worlds, the unified Earth and the divided continents to come. Pangea's coasts and oceans formed a living boundary that both defined and transcended the continent. Panthalassa, the single vast ocean surrounding the supercontinent, stretched beyond the horizon in every direction. Its currents, unobstructed by multiple landmasses, circled the globe in immense loops, redistributing heat and nutrients and shaping global climate. Along the continental margins, shallow seas and long continental shelves supported ecosystems richer than any on land. Here, warm sunlight penetrated clear waters, nurturing reefs built by early corals, sponges, and microbial communities. Primitive fishes and early sharks prowled among these structures, while ammonites and brachiopods populated the seafloor. Sediments carried by rivers from the interior enriched these coastal shelves, linking the fertility of the land to the abundance of the sea. Seasonal monsoons and storms shifted coastlines, building new deltas and drowning old floodplains. Over time, entire regions alternated between dry land and shallow sea, forcing plants and animals to adapt again and again. In these coastal transition zones, amphibians and reptiles pushed their limits. Amphibians lingered in estuaries, still dependent on water for reproduction, while reptiles adapted to brackish environments and learned to venture farther inland. Early ancestors of turtles, crocodiles, and marine reptiles may have first experimented with life along these shifting shorelines, where the ocean offered both danger and opportunity. Panthalassa itself was not static. Tides, storms, and undercurrents reshaped coasts, eroded cliffs, and deposited minerals far from their source. Dust from Pangea's deserts settled into the sea, fertilizing plankton blooms that fed entire food webs. Migrating creatures carried nutrients back to land in their bodies, closing the loop between ocean and continent. Standing on a Pangean beach, you would see no neighboring continent across the water, only an endless expanse of blue under an enormous sky. The breathing skin of the planet connecting everything. By the late Permian, life on Pangea had reached a complex, interconnected peak. Forests, wetlands, deserts, and coasts formed a single web of habitats, and species moved freely between them. Yet the same forces that had built this world were preparing to overturn it. Climate grew more erratic, volcanic activity intensified, atmospheric composition shifted. This was an age of transition in which every adaptation would be tested. Plants evolved new strategies to survive. In wetter regions, seed ferns and conifers built layered canopies that trapped humidity and stabilized soils. In the drier interior, cycads and drought-resistant shrubs dominated, their stiff leaves and deep roots reflecting millions of years of trial and error. As conditions changed, forests advanced and retreated like tides, leaving behind patchwork landscapes that forced animals to migrate or perish. Insects diversified further, some developing more social behaviors and colonizing arid environments. Termite-like species burrowed into soil and wood, creating microhabitats and shaping nutrient cycles. These insects supported the reptiles and synapsids that hunted them, and in turn were preyed upon by larger predators. Even small shifts in insect populations rippled upward through the food web, altering the balance of entire ecosystems. Synapsids continued to lead the evolutionary experiment. Some lines became more mammal-like, with improved lung capacity, differentiated teeth, and possibly hair-like insulation. Others specialized as herbivores, spreading across the continent in herds that left trackways stretching for kilometers. Predators grew faster, sleeker, and more intelligent to keep pace with their prey. This was not simply survival. It was an arms race on a planetary stage. Meanwhile, the first signs of continental rifting began to reshape migration routes. Valleys, uplands, and fault zones appeared as new obstacles or corridors. Rivers changed course, mountains rose, and lowlands turned to lakes. Each change split populations, isolated gene pools, and triggered bursts of innovation. Evolution, once operating across a unified landmass, began to fragment into regional stories that would set the stage for the Mesozoic world to come. To live at this time would have been to feel the earth in motion. Forests shifting, deserts creeping, coastlines flooding, and the ground itself stretching underfoot. It was a world of anticipation, preparing to hand its legacy to the next age. The legacy of Pangea reaches far beyond its own time. The mountains raised during its assembly, the Appalachians in North America, the Atlas in Africa, and others, still stand as ancient scars of its collisions. The red beds and coal seams of its deserts and swamps continue to shape modern geology and energy. Fossils scattered across continents now divided by oceans tell the story of a world once whole. Even the wind patterns and ocean currents of today still echo the configurations first set in motion by the supercontinent. Pangea also altered evolution's tempo. By uniting ecosystems, it created global pathways for species to spread and interact, fostering diversity and competition on an unprecedented scale. When the continent eventually broke apart, these same species were carried to isolated regions, where they evolved separately and gave rise to the distinctive floras and faunas of the Mesozoic. Without Pangea's great unification, the age of dinosaurs and mammals might have unfolded very differently. The breakup of the supercontinent set in motion a new Earth. Oceans opened between drifting fragments, climates reorganized, and life adapted to the emerging mosaic of isolated continents. Yet the memory of Pangea remained locked in the planet's crust and in the DNA of the species it shaped. Every mountain range, every fossil lineage, every sediment layer from this era is a record of a world that once defied boundaries. For your audience on Journey Through Time, this story is more than geology. It's a reminder that Earth has never been static. Continents move, climates shift, and life reimagines itself in response. Standing on today's shores, looking across modern oceans, we can still trace the ancient seams that once held the world together. Pangea was both an ending and a beginning, the culmination of millions of years of drift and collision, and the seed of the continents we know now. To imagine Pangea is to step into a world of extremes and connections, to feel the power of deep time under your feet, and to recognize that our planet's history is one of perpetual transformation. This is the heart of Journey Through Time, bringing the distant past into vivid focus and revealing how the Earth we inhabit was forged across unimaginable spans of time. Deep inside Pangea, even as deserts expanded and forests shifted, the planet's heartbeat continued underfoot. Tectonic pressures built slowly but inexorably, bending the crust and opening hidden weaknesses. In some regions, these stresses produced long fault zones where earthquakes rattled the land, tilting rock layers and diverting rivers. Elsewhere, magma intruded silently, feeding networks of underground chambers that would one day erupt as the continent's seams gave way. Life adapted to these subtle but powerful changes, rivers carving new paths left behind oxbow lakes and fertile floodplains, drawing herds of synapsid herbivores and the predators that stalked them. Fresh volcanic soils created bursts of plant growth, attracting insects and reptiles. In dry basins, evaporating lakes left salt flats and mineral deposits, shaping unique microhabitats where only the most specialized organisms could survive. Every geological shift became an ecological experiment, testing resilience and innovation. By this time, reptiles had pushed far into evolutionary experiments that blurred the line between ancient and modern. Some developed semi-upright postures for faster movement, Others refined their breathing systems to draw scarce oxygen from the air. Therapsids grew increasingly diverse, hinting at the mammalian traits to come: more efficient jaws, sharper senses, and perhaps early forms of warm-blooded metabolism. Predators and prey co-evolved at a scale no longer confined to small regions, but spanning an entire supercontinent. Atmospheric circulation over Pangea also continued to evolve. Seasonal monsoons, now driven by the continent's sheer size and its position across the equator, produced dramatic swings in climate. Coastal forests flooded during wet seasons and dried during droughts, while the interior oscillated between extreme heat and rare cold snaps. Winds swept dust from deserts into upland streams, where it mixed with volcanic minerals to fertilize distant soils. This movement of material bound the continent together as surely as rivers and migration routes did. To walk across Pangea at this point in its history would be to experience a planet still whole, but restless, a land where every horizon hinted at power beneath the surface. Mountains still rose from ancient collisions, but cracks were opening quietly, unseen. Forests still grew dense near coasts, but deserts pressed deeper inward. The supercontinent was approaching a threshold, its ecosystems thriving, its geology straining, its atmosphere in flux, preparing for the moment when unity would give way to fragmentation and a new world order would begin. By the time Pangea had stabilized into its full expanse, its ecosystems reached extraordinary complexity. Mountain chains built during ancient collisions acted as climatic anchors, directing winds and rainfall across thousands of kilometers. Rivers born in uplands carved deep valleys, feeding immense deltas and inland seas, then carrying minerals back to the ocean. Every part of the continent was tied into this loop, from the driest interior to the most humid coasts. The forests now displayed distinct regional characters. Along the equator, dense seed fern jungles created permanent twilight beneath their canopies. In temperate zones, conifers formed towering green corridors along rivers, stabilizing banks and enriching soils. On the high plateaus, drought-resistant cycads and low shrubs held out against fierce winds. Animals adapted to each zone, amphibians and insects crowding the wetlands, synapsid herbivores and predators moving through plains, and reptiles pioneering the upland drylands. Evolution unfolded on a continental stage. A reptile species emerging in the equatorial forests could, over generations, migrate into semi-arid uplands, transforming under new pressures into a related but distinct form. This fluid movement of life blurred the boundaries of ecosystems and accelerated diversification. Fossils from this period show not just static forms, but shifting distributions, overlapping trackways, and mixed assemblages of species now found oceans apart. Pangea's sheer size also changed the timing of seasons. Monsoons could last months, feeding enormous floods across lowlands, while dry spells stretched longer than any modern drought. Dust storms rolled from the interior into coastal belts, fertilizing forests and reefs. The entire climate system behaved as one giant engine, each region influencing every other in a feedback loop unique to a supercontinent. In this vast world, early reptiles and synapsids were not just surviving, they were experimenting. The amniotic egg, upright limb posture, differentiated teeth, and improved respiratory systems all signaled the shift from waterbound ancestors to true land dominators. The therapsids, precursors to mammals, expanded in form and function. Some became large plant eaters with powerful digestive tracts. Others evolved saber-like teeth and swift bodies to hunt them. Fossil evidence hints at complex behaviors. Trackways show herd movement among dicynodonts and possible pack or family structures among predators. Bone beds reveal seasonal die-offs, suggesting migrations tied to monsoon cycles or drought refuges. These patterns indicate a new level of ecological sophistication. Social structures, coordinated movement, and adaptation to a landscape of extremes. Insects remained indispensable. Giant dragonflies and millipede-like arthropods still haunted the forests, while more social species, termite-like builders and primitive ants, created microhabitats that shaped plant growth and soil chemistry. These small creatures formed the base of food chains, feeding the reptiles, amphibians, and early synapsids that defined the age. Even the oceans reflected this evolutionary ferment. Shallow reefs hosted ammonites, brachiopods, and early crustaceans, while the open waters of Panthalassa supported large predatory fish and early sharks. The boundary between land and sea blurred with tidal flats, lagoons, and estuaries, serving as nurseries for both marine and terrestrial life. In this transitional zone, many lineages took their first steps toward new lifestyles that would dominate later eras. Pangea's interior continued to act as a crucible of resilience. Deserts grew vaster and more intense, yet even in these harsh regions, life persisted. Low, hardy vegetation anchored soils against constant wind. Seasonal floods from distant mountains carved temporary rivers that became lifelines for migrating animals. Fossils record sudden bursts of activity around these transient water sources, footprints of reptiles and synapsids converging on drying lakes, bone beds of species that failed to escape before drought returned. The extreme conditions of the interior drove innovation. Small body size, burrowing habits, nocturnal behavior, and efficient water retention all appeared as survival strategies. Over generations, these traits produced new lineages adapted specifically to aridity, a preview of the specialized desert fauna that would emerge millions of years later on divided continents. Dust from the great interior deserts did not remain there. Winds swept it across Pangea, feeding forests and coastal ecosystems with minerals. This cross-continental fertilization tied together regions otherwise separated by climate extremes. The deserts thus played a paradoxical role, emptying life from their centers while feeding it at their margins. For humans imagining Pangea today, the interior reveals the scale of deep time. These were not temporary droughts, but climates lasting millions of years. Plants and animals did not simply endure. They evolved to fit patterns far slower and larger than any modern environment. In this way, the heart of Pangea became a proving ground for life's endurance. Beneath the visible landscapes, the Earth's crust was quietly rewriting itself. Magma intruded along deep fractures, forming vast underground dikes and sills. Heat built up under the thickened continental crust, weakening it from below. Over millions of years, these stresses prepared the way for the first true splits. Rift valleys formed, their floors sinking and their edges rising into new mountain chains. Lakes filled the depressions, creating habitats unlike any before, warm, fertile, and dotted with volcanic vents releasing minerals into the water. These nascent rifts altered rainfall and wind patterns. Moisture pooled along new lowlands, while adjacent uplands grew drier, shifting vegetation belts and animal ranges. Populations that once moved freely now found themselves separated by lakes or mountain ridges, triggering genetic divergence. In this environment, reptiles and synapsids diversified rapidly, exploiting new niches and testing adaptations that would define the Triassic world to come. Volcanic activity along the rifts also reshaped the atmosphere. Carbon dioxide levels spiked, enhancing greenhouse conditions, while ash clouds periodically cooled the surface. Such swings placed further stress on ecosystems already under pressure from climatic extremes. Yet they also created bursts of fertility, as fresh minerals entered soils and streams. Evolution in Pangea was thus tied to geology, not just in location, but in tempo, each eruption and rift setting the stage for the next wave of change. For an observer on the ground, the rifts would be awe-inspiring. Kilometer-wide valleys, splitting forests, waterfalls plunging into new basins, and chains of young volcanoes glowing at night. The supercontinent was still one landmass, but its future outlines were beginning to emerge in stone and fire. The world of Pangea at this point stood on the edge of transformation. Its unified landmass, once an engine of global mixing, was beginning to fracture into corridors of isolation. Climate belts shifted, deserts pressed further into once green regions, and coastal forests retreated under the combined pressure of droughts, floods, and volcanic upheaval. Life was forced to adapt or move, carving the first pathways toward the ecosystems of the Mesozoic. Plants continued to anchor this changing world. Seed ferns and conifers held their ground in river valleys and highlands, while cycads and drought-resistant shrubs claimed new territory in semi-arid zones. These belts acted as migratory highways for animals, linking distant parts of the continent, even as rifts opened between them. Reptiles and synapsids evolved new forms suited to the transitional landscape. Some grew lighter and faster for long migrations. Others developed bulk and endurance to survive harsh seasons. Insects diversified into more specialized roles, building complex colonies that influenced soil and plant growth. Every adaptation reflected the new geography, a supercontinent that was no longer simply one connected world, but a patchwork of emerging regions. Meanwhile, Panthalassa remained a stabilizing yet unpredictable force. Its vast currents still wrapped the globe, but with coastlines shifting, its influence on climate changed. Monsoon patterns became more irregular, storms more intense. Dust from the interior fertilized marine ecosystems, but also signaled deepening aridity on land. The feedback between ocean and continent grew more complex, mirroring the Earth's slow pivot toward its next chapter. To stand anywhere on Pangea now would be to feel the future rising underfoot. Continents straining, climates recalibrating, and life recalculating its strategies for survival. This was no longer the stable, unified stage of earlier times, but a living world in transition, preparing to scatter its pieces and redefine the face of the Earth. By this stage of Pangea's history, the supercontinent had become a planet-spanning laboratory of climate and life. From the humid equatorial forests to the polar ice sheets in the south, every ecosystem reflected the continent's vast scale. The unified landmass produced global wind systems unmatched in today's fragmented world. Air masses could travel thousands of kilometers without interruption, carrying dust, moisture, and heat across entire hemispheres. This connectivity produced monsoon cycles that dwarfed modern analogs, alternating between deluges and droughts on timescales, measured in seasons and millennia alike. Forests at the equator continued to sequester massive amounts of carbon, but as volcanic activity increased and oxygen levels dropped, these forests receded. Seed ferns gave way to drought-resistant cycads and conifers, while the wetlands of earlier ages dried into patchy corridors. Each retreat of the forest created new niches for reptiles and synapsids, which diversified to fill the open ground. Predators refined speed, endurance, and complex behavior to track prey across increasingly exposed terrain. In the highlands, Mountain chains like the ancestral Appalachians funneled winds and rivers, shaping the continent's hydrology. Erosion carried minerals from these uplands into lowland basins, building fertile soils where new plant communities took hold. The rivers themselves were dynamic, switching courses over geological time and leaving abandoned channels filled with life. Fossilized trackways and ripple marks preserved in these sediments testify to constant movement of water, of animals, of entire ecosystems responding to shifting ground beneath their feet. Standing on a Pangean plateau during this time, you would feel a continent alive with motion. Storms rising from the equator, winds screaming across dry basins, herds of synapsids migrating between shrinking forests, and ash falling from distant volcanoes. It was a single world, but one beginning to show the tensions that would eventually break it apart. The seas surrounding Pangea mirrored its transformations. Panthalassa's unbroken expanse became a conveyor belt of heat, driving global climate patterns. Along the margins of the supercontinent, shallow epicontinental seas flooded inland during high stands, creating warm lagoons and estuaries that acted as nurseries for marine and terrestrial species alike. These zones became laboratories for evolution, where early marine reptiles experimented with new body plans and amphibious lifestyles. Coral-like reefs and sponge mounds flourished in these shallow seas. Ammonites with elaborately coiled shells, trilobite survivors, brachiopods, and primitive crustaceans populated the seafloor, forming food chains topped by early sharks and giant predatory fish. Dust and nutrients from Pangea's interior fertilized plankton blooms that fed this teeming life. Migrating creatures returned those nutrients to land in the form of eggs, carcasses, and waste, knitting the biosphere together across the boundary between land and sea. Storms along the Pangean coasts were of a scale difficult to imagine today. With no other continents to deflect them, winds generated by monsoon shifts and thermal contrasts built colossal wave systems. Tidal flats extended for hundreds of kilometers, exposed at low tide and submerged at high. Fossils of reptile and amphibian footprints on these flats show where they hunted or basked between floods. Periodic sea level changes left layer upon layer of sediments, recording these rhythms like the grooves of a record. The ocean floor beneath Panthalassa also evolved. Submarine volcanoes built chains of islands and seamounts, which sometimes breached the surface as temporary land bridges. These acted as stepping stones for life, allowing dispersal across otherwise unbroken seas. In this way, the ocean remained as dynamic as the land, a partner in the planetary experiment of Pangea. Within Pangea's interior, the interplay of climate, vegetation, and animal life reached a level of complexity unseen before. Entire food webs spanned thousands of kilometers, linked by migration routes and seasonal shifts. Herds of synapsid herbivores could graze along rivers for months, then move hundreds of kilometers to new basins as conditions changed. Predators followed these migrations, developing endurance and cooperative strategies to exploit the moving resource. Fossilized trackways reveal parallel paths and converging routes, hinting at social behavior and long-distance travel. Plants responded to these pressures by evolving new reproductive strategies. Wind-pollinated species spread pollen across vast distances, while seed-bearing plants dispersed their offspring through animal carriers. This two-way exchange accelerated plant evolution and created co-adaptations between species separated by continents today, but united then. Insects became indispensable partners, developing mutualisms that would persist for hundreds of millions of years. The extreme interior also hosted its own microhabitats. Springs, salt flats, and ephemeral lakes provided oases where life clustered during dry seasons. When rains returned, these patches exploded with activity, filling with amphibians, insects, and small reptiles. Fossil deposits from such sites show sudden mass gatherings and die-offs, capturing snapshots of an ecosystem oscillating between abundance and scarcity. Even in these marginal zones, evolution forged the prototypes of future lineages. Burrowing reptiles experimented with more efficient thermoregulation. Herbivores developed complex dentition to process tough, drought-stressed plants. Early mammal-like creatures refined parental care and social behavior to protect young in unstable environments. These innovations set the stage for resilience in the world that would follow Pangea's breakup. The sky above Pangea told its own story of change. High-altitude winds, shaped by the continent's size and the position of mountain chains, moved heat and moisture around the globe. Seasonal shifts produced monsoon systems that could drench coasts and deltas for months before withdrawing into years-long droughts. Dust plumes from the interior traveled across oceans, fertilizing distant marine ecosystems and altering atmospheric chemistry. Oxygen and carbon dioxide levels fluctuated in step with volcanic activity and plant expansion. When forests thrived, oxygen rose and temperatures stabilized. When eruptions spiked carbon dioxide, greenhouse warming intensified and oxygen declined. These swings affected body size, metabolism, and distribution of species. Giant insects diminished as oxygen dropped. Reptiles with efficient lungs spread in their place. The light itself changed. Fine volcanic aerosols scattered the sun's rays, producing deep red sunsets and eerie twilights. Lightning storms rolled across deserts, igniting fires that transformed landscapes overnight. Even the stars seemed brighter above the continent's dry interior, where thin air and little moisture allowed clear views of the cosmos. For early mammal-like creatures and reptiles alike, these atmospheric rhythms set the tempo of life, migration, and reproduction. This dynamic atmosphere was not simply a backdrop, but an engine of evolution. Winds carried seeds, spores, and insects across impossible distances. Rain patterns created corridors of fertility, linking distant habitats. Long dry spells selected for endurance and mobility, while sudden floods rewarded opportunistic breeders. In this way, the sky bound together forests, deserts, and oceans as much as the land did, shaping a unified world, always on the edge of transformation. Beneath all this activity, tectonic forces continued to prepare the next act of Earth's story. The supercontinent's weight pressed down on the mantle, building heat and stress. Rift zones deepened into valleys dotted with volcanoes, and cracks widened into embryonic oceans. Lakes formed where the crust sagged, and rivers changed direction, creating new basins rich in minerals. Over millions of years, these processes would tear Pangea into the continents we know today. This geological prelude reshaped ecosystems even before the land masses drifted apart. Rising mountains altered wind patterns, making wet regions dry and dry regions wetter. Newly formed basins trapped water and sediments, creating isolated environments that encouraged speciation. Plants and animals that had once roamed freely now began to evolve separately, marking the first steps toward the biogeography of the Mesozoic. Volcanic activity along the rifts injected vast amounts of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, warming the planet even as other eruptions produced aerosols that briefly cooled it. These swings in climate became sharper and more frequent, testing the resilience of every species. Fossil records from this time show both extinction and innovation, old lineages vanishing, new ones emerging with traits suited to a fragmented and unstable world. To witness this stage of Pangea's history would be to see the planet in slow motion, a world still whole but already dividing at its seams, valleys deepening, mountains rising, oceans whispering into existence, forests migrating, deserts expanding, rivers seeking new paths, life adapting, experimenting, and preparing, often unknowingly, for the age of dinosaurs and mammals that lay ahead. This was no longer simply a supercontinent. It was a crucible, a dynamic system forging the pieces of a new Earth. By now, the slow tectonic stretching of Pangea had produced a continent threaded with fractures and basins. These rift valleys created entirely new habitats: long, narrow lakes, wetlands rich in minerals, and volcanic highlands dotted with geysers and hot springs. Rivers once flowing steadily across plains now fell into new depressions, carving waterfalls and deltas unlike anything the supercontinent had seen before. Each of these changes offered both disruption and opportunity, splitting populations, but also creating novel environments for life to exploit. As the land stretched, climatic belts shifted yet again. Wetlands formed along rift floors where groundwater and rainfall pooled, attracting synapsid herbivores and amphibians. Uplands at the rift edges became drier and windier, testing the endurance of plants and animals alike. Over generations, species adapted to these gradients, producing forms specialized for narrow ecological niches. Fossils from these transitional zones show an astonishing mix of coastal, desert, and upland species, all preserved together, evidence of an environment in flux. Volcanoes along the rifts were now more numerous and vigorous, releasing pulses of lava that built plateaus and ash that fertilized surrounding soils. Dust clouds from eruptions traveled deep into the interior, cooling the climate for years before dissipating and allowing greenhouse conditions to return. This rhythm of eruption, cooling, and warming became a hallmark of late Pangea, a cycle visible in the layered sediments of every rift valley. In these unstable settings, reptiles and early mammal-like creatures thrived as opportunists. Burrowers exploited ash-softened soils, migrators followed shifting rivers, and predators learned to track prey across landscapes continually rewritten by tectonics and climate. It was an age of experimentation on a planetary scale, each rift a crucible for new life. Beyond the rifts, the interior of Pangea had grown harsher than ever. Vast deserts rivaled entire continents in size, with dune fields stretching to the horizon. Winds sculpted the sand into towering ridges and star-shaped patterns, shifting constantly under an enormous sky. Daytime temperatures soared, while nights plunged into near-freezing cold. In this environment, only the most resilient organisms could persist. Yet these deserts were not lifeless. Drought-adapted conifers formed sparse groves along seasonal watercourses. Hardy cycads clustered around springs. Small reptiles hunted insects in the shade of low shrubs, and early synapsids scavenged whatever they could find. Fossilized burrows show that many creatures escaped the heat underground, emerging at night to feed and reproduce. Over time, these adaptations produced distinct lineages with specialized metabolisms and behaviors. Dust from these deserts became a global resource. Carried by high-altitude winds, it fertilized distant forests and reefs, altering ocean productivity and indirectly influencing atmospheric carbon. Even in apparent barrenness, the deserts of Pangea drove planetary cycles, their minerals feeding life far away. This paradox, emptiness sustaining abundance, was a defining feature of the supercontinent's late stage. For an observer, crossing such a desert would mean days without shade, a horizon of rolling sand, and stars so bright at night they cast shadows. It was here, in these extremes that some of the hardiest ancestors of future reptiles and mammals proved their capacity to endure and adapt. While the interior baked, the coasts remained dynamic laboratories of life. Epicontinental seas surged inland, drowning lowlands and creating warm, shallow waters teeming with marine creatures. Reefs flourished, built not just by corals, but by sponges and microbial mats, their intricate structures sheltering ammonites, crustaceans, and early marine reptiles. These waters acted as evolutionary accelerators, forcing adaptations to salt, tides, and predator-prey pressures distinct from the land. Amphibious reptiles explored this blurred boundary, developing stronger limbs, modified lungs, and protective scales to withstand salt spray and desiccation. Some lineages began to exploit fish as a primary food source, leading to more efficient jaws and teeth. Others learned to bask on beaches between foraging trips, hinting at the lifestyles that would one day give rise to fully marine reptiles of the Mesozoic. Storms along these coasts were colossal. Monsoon winds funneled moisture from Panthalassa deep into the continent, then reversed, carrying dust and ash back to sea. Wave systems carved cliffs, built barrier islands, and rearranged deltas. Fossilized ripple marks, tidal laminations, and storm beds preserve these forces in rock today, silent records of a restless shoreline. Life responded to these cycles with plasticity. Fish developed flexible diets, reptiles refined salt excretion mechanisms, and plants colonized brackish marshes. Each storm or sea level change reshuffled the deck, creating new opportunities for the adaptable and dead ends for the inflexible. In this way, the coastlines of Pangea acted as a testing ground for resilience that would echo into future oceans. High above Pangea, atmospheric circulation reached a complexity rarely matched in Earth's history. With a single supercontinent, jet streams formed vast continuous loops. Moisture from equatorial seas could reach the polar ice sheets largely unimpeded, while dust from the deserts could circle the globe. This created global teleconnections. A volcanic eruption in one corner could affect rainfall thousands of kilometers away, and a change in monsoon timing could alter ocean currents on the far side of the planet. Oxygen levels now hovered lower than in earlier times, favoring animals with efficient respiratory systems. Carbon dioxide levels fluctuated widely, causing rapid climate swings that stressed plants and animals alike. Forests advanced and retreated like tides, and deserts responded with expansions or contractions measured in geological eye blinks. Species that had once dominated began to decline, replaced by more adaptable lineages poised for the Mesozoic revolution. Insects mirrored these changes. Giant forms waned as oxygen fell, while smaller, more efficient species proliferated. Pollination strategies diversified, linking plants and insects in mutual dependencies. These relationships would persist through mass extinction and continental breakup, carrying forward into the modern world. At night, under clearer skies than almost any modern place, stars blazed in extraordinary clarity. The Milky Way arced overhead, and meteors traced the thin atmosphere. For early mammal-like creatures, these celestial rhythms may have guided migrations or reproductive cycles. The sky itself was a clock, a compass, and a signal of change. Beneath this dynamic surface, Earth was readying the next epoch. Magma welled up along lengthening rifts, feeding lava fields and volcanic chains that stretched for hundreds of kilometers. These eruptions altered atmospheric chemistry, contributing to the environmental stresses that would culminate in the end Permian mass extinction, the largest in Earth's history. Yet even as ecosystems strained, they also innovated, producing the resilient lineages that would dominate the Triassic. Plants evolved tougher seeds and more efficient water retention, spreading into marginal habitats and holding soil against erosion. Reptiles diversified into niches left vacant by declining species, and synapsids continued refining mammalian traits, setting the stage for their descendants to flourish after the extinction. Insects adapted with remarkable speed, colonizing new plant communities and linking ecosystems across climatic gradients. Geological processes sculpted landscapes into unfamiliar forms. Rift valleys deepened, lakes widened, and volcanic uplands rose. Rivers once flowing to interior basins now drained toward nascent oceans, creating new corridors for migration and isolating populations elsewhere. This fragmentation broke the continental unity that had defined Pangea, replacing it with a patchwork of evolving provinces. To stand on Pangea in this moment would be to sense an impending shift on a planetary scale. The ground trembled with volcanic rumblings, the sky darkened with ash, and migrations grew more desperate as climates swung between extremes. This was the threshold of mass extinction and renewal, a turning point in Earth's story when the old order gave way to the new. The approach of the end Permian period cast a long shadow over Pangea. For hundreds of thousands of years, the planet had been building toward a threshold. Immense volcanic outpourings, particularly in what is now Siberia, released staggering quantities of greenhouse gases, ash, and aerosols. These events altered ocean chemistry, stripped oxygen from the seas, and destabilized climate patterns across the supercontinent. The Earth system, which had operated as a single interconnected engine, now began to falter under its own scale. On land, forests withered under prolonged droughts and acidic rains. Conifers retreated to mountain slopes and river valleys. Seed ferns collapsed in many regions. Deserts expanded deeper into former greenbelts. As vegetation declined, soils eroded more easily, choking rivers and deltas with sediment. This erosion reduced the fertility of wetlands and disrupted the cycles that had bound forests, rivers, and oceans together. In the oceans, anoxia spread as currents slowed and warm water trapped nutrients at the surface. Coral-like reefs dissolved, ammonite populations collapsed, and vast swaths of the seafloor became uninhabitable. With the base of the food chain compromised, marine ecosystems spiraled downward. The fossil record shows entire lineages disappearing in a geological instant, leaving only a few hardy survivors. Despite these crises, evolution did not stop. Pioneer plants colonized disturbed soils, insects adapted to new niches, and reptiles diversified even as older lineages died out. This constant turnover sowed the seeds of the Triassic biosphere. The same forces that caused catastrophe also opened ecological space for innovation, a paradox of destruction and creation at the heart of Earth's deep time story. In the midst of this upheaval, synapsids, the ancestors of mammals, faced their own bottleneck. Once dominant across Pangea, many large herbivorous forms disappeared under the twin pressures of drought and predation. Yet smaller, more adaptable therapsids survived by exploiting marginal habitats, burrowing underground, or adopting nocturnal lifestyles. These survivors carried forward traits that would define mammals: efficient metabolism, complex jaws, differentiated teeth, and perhaps even early insulating fur. Reptiles, meanwhile, seized the vacated niches. Diapsids diversified rapidly, experimenting with body plans and ecological roles that foreshadowed the rise of dinosaurs. Some grew large and heavily built to dominate herbivorous niches. Others became swift predators. This adaptive radiation, unleashed in the vacuum of extinction, reshaped the balance of terrestrial life. Insects also weathered the storm with remarkable flexibility. While giant forms disappeared, smaller species evolved new reproductive strategies, shorter life cycles, and mutualisms with surviving plants. Pollination, seed dispersal, and soil aeration continued largely uninterrupted, maintaining the basic functioning of ecosystems even as their visible components transformed. These survival strategies underscored a key principle of deep time. Innovation thrives under stress. The harsh conditions of late Pangea acted as a filter, selecting for resilience, efficiency, and versatility. Those lineages that endured would define the Triassic world emerging from the ruins. As the Permian drew to a close, Pangea's landscapes bore the marks of crisis and adaptation. Rift valleys had widened, deserts had swallowed forests, and lakes once teeming with life had turned brackish or vanished entirely. Yet along mountain slopes and river margins, pockets of green persisted, serving as refuges for plants and animals alike. These refugia acted as reservoirs of genetic diversity, ready to expand again when conditions improved. Geological processes continued to sculpt these sanctuaries. Volcanic ash enriched soils. Periodic floods replenished nutrients. Cooler microclimates offered respite from heat. In these oases, surviving lineages refined traits that would later enable them to radiate across the recovering world. Small burrowing reptiles honed efficient lungs, synapsids developed more complex parental care, and plants evolved hardier seeds capable of lying dormant until the rains returned. The atmosphere above reflected a world in flux. Greenhouse gases remained high, but aerosols from ongoing eruptions cooled some regions temporarily, creating unpredictable mosaics of climate. Winds shifted direction, monsoons arrived late or failed entirely, and temperature swings challenged every organism. Adaptation at this stage meant flexibility, the ability to move, hide, or hibernate until the planet's rhythms stabilized. Fossil evidence from this interval reveals both devastation and continuity. Trackways of small reptiles and synapsids appear alongside the remains of vanished giants, a juxtaposition that captures the essence of transition. The world was being remade, but not from nothing. It was being remade from the hardiest survivors of the old order. With extinction came opportunity on a planetary scale. As ecosystems collapsed, empty niches multiplied, setting the stage for a new evolutionary surge. In the early Triassic, plants recolonized barren ground, creating thin green corridors along rivers and lakes. These corridors linked isolated refuges, allowing animals to migrate and genes to flow between populations. Slowly, the web of life began to reconnect across Pangea's scarred surface. Reptiles dominated this rebirth. From small insectivores came larger forms, adapted to grazing on tough vegetation. Predators grew more agile and specialized, experimenting with upright limb posture and faster locomotion. These innovations foreshadowed the full rise of the archosaurs, the lineage that would produce dinosaurs, crocodiles, and pterosaurs. Synapsids, though reduced, continued to evolve toward mammalian traits. Their skulls became lighter, their jaws more sophisticated, and their metabolisms more efficient. Burrowing behaviors, nocturnal activity, and parental care all contributed to survival, laying the groundwork for the first true mammals. The atmosphere also began to stabilize. With fewer forests and more open ground, carbon cycles slowed, but new plant communities eventually restored some balance. Monsoon patterns re-emerged, though weaker, and deserts began to recede at their edges. This new world was not the lush Permian Pangea, but a transitional landscape poised for diversification. The interplay of geology and biology was thus renewed. Rift valleys continued to deepen, but their lakes nurtured life. Volcanic soils enriched recovering ecosystems. Winds carried seeds farther than before. Evolution's laboratory was open again, and its experiments would shape the Mesozoic era. By the early Triassic, Pangea stood as both a monument to the past and a blueprint for the future. Its unified landmass still stretched from pole to pole, but its internal dynamics had transformed. Gone were the dense forests of the late Carboniferous and Permian. In their place spread open woodlands, scrub, and hardy pioneer plants. Rivers and lakes stitched together these new habitats, acting as arteries through which life flowed back into a wounded world. The animals that survived now defined the planet's trajectory. Early archosaurs explored every available niche, on land, in water, and perhaps gliding through the air. Synapsids persisted as small, resilient forms, refining mammalian characteristics under the cover of night. Insects diversified to match the new flora, creating fresh networks of pollination and seed dispersal. Geological activity remained intense. Rifts widened, mountains shifted, and Panthalassa's currents adjusted to new coastlines. Dust storms still fertilized distant regions, while monsoons carved seasonal rhythms into the recovering ecosystems. Each process linked the whole, ensuring that no region evolved in isolation. This was a world still under construction, a global workshop of adaptation and innovation. From the ashes of the Permian extinction, the building blocks of future biodiversity were taking shape. Dinosaurs, mammals, modern-style forests, and complex food webs all had their roots in these tenuous beginnings on a unified yet unstable Earth. To witness Pangea at this moment would be to see resilience embodied, a planet battered but not broken, assembling the pieces of its next great chapter under a single sky. By the Middle Triassic, Pangea had evolved into a landscape of striking contrasts. The scars of extinction remained visible in vast barren stretches, yet along river valleys and rift lakes, life had surged back with astonishing speed. Conifers, cycads, and ginkgos now dominated the plant world, their seeds carried by wind and animals alike. These hardy plants stabilized soils, formed patchwork forests, and provided food for the new waves of herbivores. The animal kingdom reflected this rebound. Early archosaurs diversified into both crocodile-like and dinosaur-like forms, testing new limb postures, metabolisms, and ecological roles. Amphibians, though diminished, lingered in swamps and lakes, acting as relics of an earlier age. Insects radiated into fresh niches, refining pollination relationships and soil engineering behaviors that bound ecosystems together. Tectonic forces continued to shape migration and climate. Rift valleys deepened, creating corridors of humidity and fertility through otherwise dry regions. These green threads linked distant populations and accelerated gene flow across the continent. Fossils from this interval show overlapping trackways of herbivores and predators moving along these corridors, a testament to the persistence of life in a changing world. The skies above Pangea now hosted new atmospheric circulation patterns. Monsoons strengthened as Panthalassa's currents adjusted to shifting coastlines, bringing seasonal rains to once parched lands. Yet extremes still dominated. Prolonged droughts followed by catastrophic floods, storms of a magnitude no modern observer could fathom. Life in this era demanded versatility, mobility, and endurance, traits that would define the dominant lineages of the Mesozoic. The rise of archosaurs marked a pivotal shift in terrestrial ecosystems. Some archosaurs developed into swift bipedal predators, honing the anatomy that would later characterize true dinosaurs. Others evolved heavy, semi-aquatic bodies, suited to river deltas and coastal lagoons, echoing the crocodiles to come. This evolutionary burst unfolded against a backdrop of expanding deserts, deepening rifts, and increasingly complex climates. Synapsids, though reduced, continued to innovate in the margins. Small burrowing forms exploited insect-rich soils, refining endothermy and parental care. These early mammal-like creatures occupied nocturnal niches, avoiding daytime heat and predation, and setting the template for mammals' future ecological strategies. Plant communities also shifted. Ginkgos and seed ferns gave way to gymnosperms, with tougher seeds and drought-tolerant leaves. These plants formed mosaics of open woodland and shrubland, interspersed with wetlands along rivers. Insects adapted in turn, developing more sophisticated pollination and seed dispersal strategies. Geological and atmospheric forces remained intertwined. Volcanoes along rift margins enriched soils, even as they injected greenhouse gases into the air. Dust from interior deserts fertilized coastal ecosystems, while monsoons carried humidity inland. This interplay produced a patchwork world where no single region dictated the planet's destiny, a complex system of feedback loops at continental scale. As the late Triassic dawned, the supercontinent's outlines began to foreshadow the modern world. Rift zones along what would become the Atlantic opened wider. Lakes turned brackish, and then marine, and islands of new oceanic crust rose between drifting fragments. The unity of Pangea was ending, but its influence on global life remained profound. Dinosaurs, though still small and relatively rare, began to expand into open niches. Their efficient lungs, lightweight skeletons, and upright posture gave them an edge in Pangea's variable climates. Archosaurs diversified into aerial forms, such as early pterosaurs, testing the skies as a new ecological arena. Synapsids persisted as resilient survivors, refining the warm-blooded metabolism and sensory abilities that would one day define mammals. Plants continued to anchor the system, but their distributions shifted with the climate belts. Gymnosperms colonized uplands and semi-arid zones, while ferns and horsetails dominated wetlands. Insects evolved alongside them, maintaining pollination networks and nutrient cycles. The feedback between flora and fauna created stability amid geological chaos, a living net stretched across a planet in transition. The climate itself grew increasingly unpredictable. Seasonal extremes intensified as rifts deepened and monsoon patterns shifted. Dust storms and floods alternated, reshaping landscapes and migration routes. Life's ability to adapt to rapid change became the primary determinant of survival, favoring agile, mobile species over specialists tied to vanishing habitats. To witness Pangea at this moment was to watch the seeds of the Mesozoic world being planted, dinosaurs preparing to dominate, mammals taking shape in the shadows, and continents moving toward the configuration we know today. Across hundreds of millions of years, Pangea rose, thrived, and fractured, leaving an indelible mark on our planet's history. Its assembly forged mountains, still standing today. Its unified landmass accelerated evolution, spreading species across the globe. Its breakup seeded the oceans and continents of our modern world. Every forest, desert, and ocean current carries a trace of the supercontinent's legacy. In this vast tapestry of deep time, we see a reminder that Earth is never static. Continents drift, climates shift, and life reinvents itself again and again. The story of Pangea is not just a chapter of geology. It is the foundation of the world we inhabit, shaping our planet's biology, climate, and geography. As we close this journey, imagine standing at the edge of a newly opened ocean, watching the last threads of the supercontinent unravel. The horizon stretches beyond sight. Winds carry dust from a dying desert, and new ecosystems rise where old ones collapsed. This is the cycle of Earth: creation, transformation, renewal. Thank you for traveling through this history with us on Journey Through Time, a place where Earth's deepest past becomes vivid and alive. May this story of Pangea inspire you to see our world as a dynamic, ever-changing planet, where every mountain and every wave holds echoes of ancient supercontinents and the endless march of time.